Hi, I'm Jake, and I watched our sergeant laugh in the face of an 11-year-old boy just minutes before our most important machine gun jammed for good during an ambush. He had no idea that the survival of our entire squad was resting on the shoulders of that kid, the one he treated like a stray dog. It's a moment that's burned into my memory, a perfect picture of arrogance meeting desperation. Have you ever been completely invisible, even when you knew you held the key to solving a huge problem? Before I tell you how that little boy used nothing but a discarded shell casing to fix that gun, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and make sure you subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the look on our sergeant's face when that .50 cal roared back to life. The air at our forward operating base was always thick with dust and a low-grade fear you could almost taste. But that afternoon, the tension was different. It was sharp. Our lifeline, the M2 Browning machine gun. Sitting in the main defensive nest was our guardian angel. It was the only thing standing between us and being completely overrun, and it was failing. Corporal Davis, our weapons specialist and usually the calmest guy in the unit, was on his third hour of trying to fix it. He'd stripped it down to its basic parts and reassembled it twice, his hands greasy and his face etched with frustration. Every time he test-fired it, it would let out a short, angry burst and then jam solid. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. The boy's name was Leo. He was an 11-year-old orphan from the nearby village that had been caught in the crossfire a year ago. He just sort of appeared one day, and we let him stay. He was quiet, almost unnaturally so, with eyes that seemed to see right through you. He never played. Instead, he'd watch. He'd watch us clean our rifles, watch the mechanics work on the Humvees, and most of all, he'd watch Davis wrestle with that M2. His father had been a mechanic, the kind of local legend who could make a dead engine sing with nothing but a wrench and some patience. Leo hadn't learned from books. He'd learned from watching his father's hands, absorbing the language of machines through sight and sound. That afternoon, as Davis had the gun's guts spread out on a dirty tarp, Leo silently walked over. He watched for a long moment, his head tilted. Then, he raised a small, grimy finger and pointed at the feeding mechanism, a complex piece of steel that Davis had already inspected a dozen times. He mumbled something in his broken English, something about a wrong sound. Davis, at the end of his rope, didn't even look at him. He just waved a dismissive hand. "Get out of here, kid. This isn't a playground." Sergeant Marcus, who was overseeing the whole mess, let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "He thinks he's an engineer now, Davis. Tell him to go fetch some water before he gets in the way of real work." Leo just lowered his hand and stepped back into the shadows, his face unreadable. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the valley, the dread solidified. The radio crackled to life with a chillingly calm voice from HQ. Intel confirmed significant enemy movement in our sector. An attack was no longer a possibility. It was imminent, likely before dawn. All eyes turned back to Davis. He frantically reassembled the M2 one last time, his movements jerky with desperation. He slammed the cover shut, pulled back the charging handle, and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared for a single glorious second, spitting out a 3-round burst before choking with a definitive metallic clack. It was jammed again, dead. A cold, heavy silence fell over the outpost. In that moment, we all knew we were in serious trouble. We were exposed and the enemy was coming. While the rest of us were staring at the useless weapon, our minds racing with the grim math of our situation, Leo was still watching, but he wasn't looking at the gun as a whole. He wasn't focused on Davis's panicked movements or the sergeant's grim face. He was listening. He had been listening the whole time. Just before each jam, he'd heard it. A faint, high-pitched metallic scrape, like a fingernail being dragged across slate. It was a sound so subtle, it was completely lost to the rest of us amidst the clatter of parts and the ambient noise of the base. But to Leo, it was a scream. It was the machine telling him exactly where it hurt. His eyes drifted from the silent gun to a small pile of spent .50 caliber shell casings glinting in the fading light. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just watched and listened, his mind connecting sounds to solutions that weren't written in any field manual. Sergeant Marcus was a man carved from granite and field regulations. His patience, already worn thin by the heat and the constant threat, had evaporated entirely. He paced behind the gun nest like a caged wolf, his voice a low growl that cut through the nervous chatter. "Davis, status report now," he'd bark, not because he expected a different answer, but because inaction was a sin he couldn't tolerate. His eyes would occasionally flick over to Leo, who was lingering just at the edge of the sandbags. It wasn't just dismissal in his look anymore, it was pure irritation. To Marcus, Leo wasn't a person. He was a variable, an unpredictable civilian element in a tightly controlled military equation. He represented chaos, a distraction from the only thing that mattered, following procedure even when procedure was failing them completely. His presence was an affront to the order Marcus was desperately trying to maintain. Corporal Davis was crumbling under the weight of it all. He was a good soldier, proud of his skills, the guy everyone turned to when things went wrong. Now, in front of the entire squad, he was failing. His pride was turning to shame, and the shame was making his hands clumsy. He fumbled with the parts, his movements, no longer precise and confident, but jerky and desperate. He wasn't trying to diagnose the problem anymore. He was just repeating the same failed steps, praying for a different outcome. The other guys tried not to stare, but you could feel their eyes on him. It was a terrible mix of pity for a friend, and the cold, selfish fear that his failure would get them all killed. He was so deep in his own personal hell of embarrassment that even if a master gunsmith had appeared, he probably wouldn't have listened. We all treated Leo like that, if I'm being honest. He was our little ghost, a piece of the village that we couldn't wash away. We'd give him a piece of a ration bar or a bottle of water, tell him to stay out of the way, and then forget he existed. It wasn't malicious, it was just how things were. Our training was hammered into us. Focus on the mission, control your sector, eliminate variables. A local kid was the biggest variable there was, so we kept him at arm's length, a mascot we felt a flicker of responsibility for but never truly saw. Watching the sergeant dismiss him so harshly felt wrong, but who was going to question Marcus? We were all locked into our roles, following the chain of command, even as it was leading us straight into a disaster. We saw the boy, but we didn't see him. Then Leo moved again. He was braver than any of us at that moment. He picked up one of the heavy, spent 50 cal casings from the dirt. He walked back to the tarp where Davis had the gun's bolt laid out. He didn't speak. He just knelt and gently scraped the rim of the casing along the bolt's T-slot, creating a faint, high-pitched scree sound. He was recreating the noise he'd heard, showing them exactly where the gun was hurting. That's when Sergeant Marcus finally snapped. He strode over, grabbed Leo firmly by the arm and pulled him to his feet. "I told you to get back, you little rat. This isn't a game," he snarled, his face inches from Leo's. He didn't hit him, but he might as well have. He physically escorted him away from the nest and pointed toward the back of the compound. "Go, now." Leo's reaction was the most haunting part of it all. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch or pull away. He just went completely still, his body slack in the sergeant's grip. His face, which was usually so expressive in its silence, became a perfect, emotionless mask. It was the look of someone who had seen so much worse that a soldier's anger was nothing. It was the look of a child who had learned that making yourself small and invisible was the only way to survive. He let Marcus lead him away, and when the sergeant released him, he just turned and walked back to his usual spot in the shadows, melting back into the background. But his eyes never left the M2. He had offered the answer, and it had been thrown back in his face. The injustice of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. As the last sliver of sun vanished, the world went from tense to terrifyingly quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes something awful. The radio crackled, the voice on the other end no longer calm. "Multiple hostiles detected, closing on your position. ETA 15 mics. 15 minutes. A lifetime and no time at all." The sergeant's face hardened into a mask of grim acceptance. The time for fixing things was over. "All right, listen up," he commanded, his voice tight. "We're pulling back to the comms tent, standard fallback pattern. Jenkins, you lay down covering fire with the source." We abandoned the M2. We all looked at each other. Abandon the nest? That wasn't a fallback plan. It was a death sentence. The comms tent was a flimsy structure with poor lines of sight. We would be trading our only defensible position for a canvas tomb. Hope, what little was left, died right then. I looked from Sergeant Marcus, who was now just a silhouette barking orders against the dying light, to Davis, who was slumped against the sandbags, the useless M2 parts at his feet, like a mechanical corpse. And then I looked at Leo. He was still in the shadows, a small, unmoving shape. And a memory hit me, something I'd overheard months ago when his father was still alive, working on a generator in the village square. Someone had asked him how he always knew what was wrong. The old man had wiped his hands on a rag, smiled and said, "Every machine sings its own song. Most people are too loud to hear it." The irony was a punch to the gut. We were all so loud, with our fear, our pride, our regulations. We were completely, utterly deaf, and the enemy was just minutes away. The first mortar round landed short, but the explosion was still close enough to make our teeth rattle. It was the starting gun for the symphony of chaos that followed. The night erupted with the distinct sharp cracks of AK-47s from the ridge opposite us. Green tracer rounds sliced through the darkness, zipping over our heads. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It cuts through training, through discipline. You could see it in the wide eyes of the younger guys. Sergeant Marcus was yelling, his voice strained, fall back to the tent! Jenkins, saw on the left flank, move!" We were moving, but it was clumsy. A scramble, not a tactical retreat. We were abandoning our best defensive position, and every single one of us knew that we were running towards a trap of our own making. A flimsy tent that wouldn't stop a single stray bullet. Corporal Davis was the last one to move. He just stood there, for a second, staring at the silent, useless M2. In the strobing light of the muzzle flashes, his face was a mask of pure anguish. This was his fault. That's what he was thinking. You could see it plain as day. All his pride, all his expertise had amounted to nothing. He had failed the squad, and now people were going to die because of it. He finally tore his eyes away from the gun, grabbed his standard-issue M4, and turned to follow us. The look on his face wasn't fear. It was something worse. It was the look of a man who had lost all faith in himself at the one moment it mattered most. He was abandoning his post, his responsibility, and a part of himself was dying right there on that dusty patch of ground. The retreat was a disaster. Jenkins tried to lay down suppressing fire with his saw, but the enemy had us zeroed in. Bullets were thudding into the sandbags around the nest with sickening, heavy thumps. A round ricocheted off the metal frame of the M2 with a high-pitched ping. That made me flinch. We were supposed to be moving in a coordinated pattern, covering each other, but we were just a bunch of guys running with our heads down, praying not to get hit. The sergeant's plan, born of desperation, was falling apart. The comms tent, our supposed safe point, seemed a million miles away. We weren't falling back. We were being herded. We had lost control, and the enemy knew it. The volume of their fire increased, a confident, terrifying roar that promised to swallow us whole. And then something happened that defied all logic. As we were all scrambling away from the gun nest, away from the point of greatest danger, one small figure ran directly into it. It was Leo. He darted out from the shadows, a tiny silhouette against the flashing chaos, and ran straight for the abandoned M2. My first thought was that he was in shock, that the noise and the fear had broken him. I opened my mouth to scream his name, to tell him to get down, but the word caught in my throat. He wasn't running wildly. He was running with a purpose, his small legs pumping, his eyes fixed on the very thing we were all fleeing from. It was the single most insane act of bravery or madness I had ever witnessed. Sergeant Marcus saw him too. He stopped mid-stride, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Leo, get down! Get back here, you little fool!" he roared, his voice cracking with the strain of the firefight. But it was useless. The noise of the battle was a physical wall of sound, swallowing his words completely. For a split second, the whole world seemed to shrink down to that one image, the terrified, angry sergeant, and the small boy who was ignoring him, ignoring the bullets, ignoring every instinct for self-preservation. It was like watching a ghost walk through a firestorm. The rest of the squad was still moving, still running for their lives, but Marcus and I were frozen, watching this impossible scene unfold. He reached the M2 and didn't even hesitate. While bullets kicked up dust just inches from his feet, he vaulted over the sandbags with a grace that was completely out of place in the middle of a war zone. His hands, small and nimble, went straight for the gun's feeding tray, the heart of the mechanism. He wasn't fumbling. He wasn't scared. It was like the rest of the world just ceased to exist for him. There was no enemy, no bullets, no screaming sergeant. There was only him and the machine. He moved with the quiet confidence of his father, the mechanic, who could diagnose a broken engine by sound alone. In that moment, he wasn't a child. He was a specialist performing a critical, high-stakes surgery. I was still pinned down behind a stack of ammo crates, torn between the order to retreat and the magnetic pull of what was happening. I saw him reach into his pocket and pull out the object I'd seen him pick up earlier. It was the spent .50 caliber shell casing. It glinted under the sporadic flashes of gunfire. He wasn't trying to pry the jammed round out. He wasn't repeating any of the steps Davis had. He slipped the rim of the casing deep into the T-slot of the bolt, a place a grown man's fingers couldn't easily reach or feel. He was doing exactly what he had tried to show us earlier. He was targeting the tiny, invisible flaw that only he had been able to hear. The enemy fire was intensifying, and our chance of survival was dwindling to zero. Our lives were now resting on a ghost of a boy with a piece of trash in his hand. With a surgeon's focus, Leo ignored the chaos. He wedged the lip of the heavy brass casing into the T-slot, the very groove Davis had cleaned and oiled a dozen times. He didn't scrape wildly. His motion was deliberate, a single, precise flick of the wrist. It was a tiny movement in a battle of explosions and gunfire. He wasn't using force. He was using feel. He was like a locksmith picking a delicate tumbler, feeling for the one tiny imperfection that was causing the entire system to fail. I could see the intense concentration on his face, illuminated by the muzzle flashes. He was in his own world, a silent bubble of mechanical communion. He was smoothing down a metal burr so minuscule that it would have been invisible to the naked eye, a flaw born from a poorly manufactured round that we had dismissed as impossible. Sergeant Marcus and I were just frozen, watching this impossible sight. My mind was screaming. A part of me wanted to run over there, grab the kid, and drag him to safety. But another part, the part that had seen him recreate the sound of the jam with a shell casing, was utterly captivated. Marcus was the same. His mouth was hanging slightly open, his order to retreat forgotten. He was a man who believed in manuals, in training, in the established order of things. And right now a child was rewriting his entire understanding of how the world worked, using a piece of garbage as a tool while bullets whizzed past his head. The sight was so fundamentally wrong, so outside the realm of our experience, that it paralyzed us. We could only stare, caught between military instinct and jaw-dropping awe. The enemy wasn't waiting for us to figure things out. A rocket-propelled grenade screamed past our heads and slammed into the side of the makeshift barracks behind us, showering the compound in splinters and dust. The explosion was a brutal reminder of our reality. "They're flanking us! East side!" someone yelled over the roar of the firefight. The enemy was getting bolder, advancing under the assumption that our main gun was out of commission for good. They were right to think so. We were losing ground, and the flimsy comms tent was looking less like a fallback point and more like a tomb. The pressure was immense. Every second that M2 stayed silent, another enemy soldier got 10 feet closer to killing us all. Our window of survival was slamming shut. I risked a glance at Sergeant Marcus. His face was a battlefield of its own. You could see the war. Inside him, the rigid, by-the-book commander fighting against the desperate man willing to try anything, to trust a child, a civilian, a mascot, with their lives, was a complete violation of his entire career. It was an admission of his own failure, of the failure of his training and his leadership, but the alternative was watching his men get cut down while retreating to an indefensible position. His knuckles were white where he gripped his rifle. He looked from the advancing enemy fire back to the small boy working calmly on the machine gun. It was a choice between certain death following the rules or a 1 in a million chance that came with swallowing every ounce of his pride. Corporal Davis had crept back toward the gun nest, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that held us captive. He was on his hands and knees behind a sandbag, peering over the top. His face was a wreck of emotions. There was the deep, burning shame of his own failure, but something else was dawning in his eyes, a flicker of professional respect. He, more than anyone, understood the intricate mechanics of that weapon. He knew every pin, every spring, every lever, and he was watching Leo do something he'd never seen in any field manual, something that made no logical sense but felt right. He was watching intuition trump training. The boy wasn't following a procedure, he was listening to the machine, and in that moment, Davis knew the kid had heard something he had been deaf to. Then, it was over. Leo pulled the shell casing out of the T-slot, looked at it for a second, and then simply tossed it aside. The whole thing had taken maybe 15 seconds. He didn't look up for approval or praise. He just finished his task. He reached over and gently pulled the charging handle back, chambering a new round with a solid, healthy clank that sounded completely different from before. The sound was full of promise. Then he looked at Corporal Davis, whose face was just inches away from the weapon. Leo didn't say a word. He just lifted his small, grimy hand and tapped Davis once on the shoulder, then pointed a single finger at the butterfly trigger. The message was clear. "It's ready. Your turn." The world seemed to slow down. The sound of the battle faded into a dull roar in the background. Everything hinged on this single moment. Sergeant Marcus took 2 steps forward, his eyes locked on the gun. He looked at Davis, who was staring back, his expression asking the question for all of us. He looked at Leo, who stood there patiently, a small, calm island in a sea of fire and death. The enemy was closing in. You could hear their shouts now, closer than ever. This was it. The final, desperate gamble. Marcus's jaw tightened. He swallowed his pride, his training, his disbelief. He took a deep breath, and through the din of the firefight, his voice cut through. Not a scream, but a command, raw and full of a terrifying hope. "Davis," he barked. "Fire." Corporal Davis didn't hesitate. There was no time. His hands, which had been clumsy with shame just minutes before, found the butterfly triggers with a newfound certainty. He squeezed. For a heart-stopping fraction of a second, there was nothing. The collective breath of the squad was held in that tiny, silent gap. We were all bracing for the familiar, soul-crushing clack of failure, the final nail in our coffin. In that sliver of time, you could see every doubt, every fear, every prayer flicker across Davis's face. He was no longer just firing a weapon, he was pulling the trigger on our last impossible hope, a hope delivered by a child he had ignored. It was a moment that stretched into an eternity, the silence before the verdict. Then, the world exploded in sound. It wasn't a short, angry burst. It was a roar, a sustained, unbroken, thunderous roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet. The M2 didn't just fire, it came alive with a furious, righteous anger. A torrent of hot brass casings streamed from the side of the weapon, arcing through the air like golden locusts in the chaotic light. The gun bucked and vibrated in Davis's grip, not with the shudder of a jam, but with the steady, rhythmic pulse of a perfectly tuned engine of destruction. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of life. It was the sound of a debt being paid, the sound of a battle turning on its head. The effect on the advancing enemy was immediate and catastrophic. They had been moving with a confident swagger, closing in for the kill on what they thought was a crippled outpost. Suddenly they were walking into a wall of lead. The .50 caliber rounds tore through the night, ripping into their positions, shredding their cover, and turning their organized assault into a panicked, desperate scramble for survival. The charge didn't just slow, it shattered. Figures that had been running towards us were now diving for cover, dragging their wounded, their disciplined advance completely. Broken, the tide of the battle hadn't just turned, it had been violently thrown back by a force they never saw coming. A strange thing happened among our own men. We stopped firing. One by one, the sounds of our M4s and the SAW went silent. We were all just watching, staring. The deafening, continuous roar of the M2 was the only sound that mattered. It was our sound, our guardian angel returned from the dead. It filled the valley, drowning out the enemy's cries and the crackle of their rifles. We stood there, mouths agape, as Davis methodically swept the gun across the enemy line, cutting them down with brutal efficiency. It was a moment of pure, stunning disbelief. We weren't soldiers in a firefight anymore. We were witnesses to a miracle performed not by a god, but by a ghost of a boy. I risked a look at Sergeant Marcus. The man who was all regulations and hardened certainty was completely undone. His rifle was lowered, his hands slack at his sides, his face, illuminated by the constant muzzle flash of the M2, was a mask of utter profound shock. The arrogance, the irritation, the dismissal, it had all been sand-blasted away, leaving behind raw, naked awe. His jaw was literally hanging open, his eyes wide and unblinking as they darted from the perfectly functioning weapon to the small soot-stained child standing calmly beside it. In that moment, Sergeant Marcus wasn't a leader of men. He was just a man, witnessing something so far beyond his comprehension that his entire world had been cracked down to its foundation. Corporal Davis was a man reborn. The shame was gone, incinerated by the heat of the 1,000 rounds per minute pouring from the weapon in his hands. He felt the perfect, smooth cycling of the bolt through the trigger grips, a sensation he had been desperately trying to achieve for hours. It was flawless. He didn't just see that the gun was working, he felt it. He was connected to it. After laying down another long, devastating burst, he paused for a second and looked over at Leo. It wasn't just a glance. It was a deep, soul-bearing look of respect, of gratitude, and of an apology that no words could ever properly convey. He, the specialist, was looking at his master. And Leo, he just stood there. He didn't cheer, he didn't smile, he didn't flinch at the deafening noise or the chaos. He simply watched the machine, his machine, work. His face was calm, his focus absolute. He was like a composer listening to his symphony being performed for the first time, noting every beat, every rhythm, ensuring it was exactly as he'd intended. The battle raged around him, a storm of fire and death that he had single-handedly redirected, but he was the quiet, unmoving eye of that storm. He had heard the song the machine was trying to sing, and he had simply tuned it. For him, the job was done. The gunfire eventually faded, replaced by a ringing silence that was somehow heavier than the noise it replaced. The M2, its barrel glowing a dull red in the darkness, ticked and pinged as it cooled. The enemy was gone, vanished back into the mountains, leaving behind a silence filled with the smell of cordite and ozone. No one moved. No one spoke. We were all just standing there, breathing in the aftermath, our minds struggling to catch up with what our eyes had just seen. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a strange, hollow feeling of disbelief. Every single soldier, from the greenest private to the sergeant himself, had their eyes fixed on one person. Not on Corporal Davis, the man who fired the gun, but on the small, silent boy who had brought it back from the dead. Sergeant Marcus was the first to break the spell. He walked forward slowly, his boots crunching softly in the dirt and spent casings. He didn't stride like a commander assessing a battlefield. He walked like a pilgrim approaching a shrine. He bypassed Davis completely and stopped right in front of Leo, who had to crane his neck to look up at him. The sergeant's face, which I had only ever seen as a mask of hardened authority or irritation, was completely bare. It was the face of a man who had just seen a ghost, a man whose entire belief system had been shattered and reassembled in the space of 5 minutes. He knelt down, putting himself at eye level with the boy. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Leo, and in his eyes you could see the weight of his own arrogance collapsing. Corporal Davis finally released his grip on the M2's butterfly triggers. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the aftershock of what had happened. He looked down at his own hands, then at the perfectly functioning weapon, and then at Leo. It was a look of profound, almost religious awe. He got up, walked over to the tarp where his tools and the discarded parts lay, and just stared at them for a long moment. It was a graveyard of his own pride. Then he walked back to Leo, unscrewed the cap from his own canteen, and held it out to the boy. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was an apology, a thank you, and an admission of defeat and respect all rolled into one. Leo took it and drank, his small gesture accepting the unspoken truce. The rest of us started to drift closer, forming a loose, silent circle around the gun nest. The usual post-firefight buzz, the nervous jokes, the loud chatter, was absent. The mood was somber, reverent. This wasn't our victory. It was his. Jenkins, the big guy who manned the saw, walked up and gently placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture so careful it was like he was afraid the boy might break. Another soldier, a kid named Miller, pulled a half-melted chocolate bar from his pocket and offered it to him. No one told them to do it. It was a spontaneous, collective acknowledgement. In the space of a single firefight, Leo had transformed. He was no longer a ghost we looked through. He was the anchor that had stopped us from being swept away. Finally, Sergeant Marcus, Found his voice. It was rough and quiet, stripped of all its usual bark. "You," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You saved us. You saved my men." He swallowed hard, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. Then he did something I will never forget as long as I live. He reached up to the sleeve of his uniform and, with a sharp, tearing sound, ripped off his squad patch. The small, embroidered piece of cloth represented our unit, our identity, our brotherhood. It was something you earned, something you died for. He held it out in the palm of his hand, offering it to Leo. "This is yours," he said. "You belong with us now." It wasn't a medal from a general. It was a piece of a soldier's soul, and it was the highest honor he could give. From that night forward, the entire dynamic of the FOB shifted on its axis. Leo was no longer an outsider. He was given a proper cot in the corner of the main barracks, and Marcus himself made sure the boy had the first and best parts of every meal. He was our little engineer. It became an unspoken rule. If a generator sputtered or a radio went on the fritz, you didn't go to the specialists first. You went to find Leo. Corporal Davis became his shadow, not to teach, but to learn. I'd often see them sitting together, Davis pointing at a complex schematic in a manual, and Leo just listening, his head tilted, hearing the silent language of the machine that the rest of us were too loud to ever understand. He never spoke much more than he had before, but he didn't have to. We had finally learned how to listen. The memory of that night never really fades. It's not the gunfire or the explosions I remember most clearly, but the silence that came after. In the weeks and months that followed, our outpost became a different place. The hard edges seemed to soften. Sergeant Marcus was never the same man. He still led with authority, but the harsh, rigid certainty was gone, replaced by a kind of quiet watchfulness. He'd look at his men differently, as if seeing them for the first time, wondering what hidden talents or secret knowledge they held inside them. He'd spend hours just sitting near Leo, watching the boy tinker with a broken radio or a sputtering generator, not saying a word. It was his penance, his education. He was learning a new language, one that had nothing to do with rank or regulations. That day, under a hail of fire, we all learned a lesson that no training manual could ever teach. It wasn't just about humility or about not underestimating a child. It was about the danger of being so sure you're right that you become deaf to the truth. We were so caught up in our own procedures, our own pride, and our own fear that we almost died for it. We looked at Leo and saw a nuisance, a distraction, because that's what our training told us to see. We were the experts, the soldiers, the ones with the answers. But our answers were wrong. The real solution was standing right there in front of us the whole time. A small boy with dirty hands who was brave enough to be quiet and just listen. Leo never changed. He didn't become a talkative hero or a miniature soldier. He remained the quiet, observant boy he always was. His power wasn't in giving orders. It was in seeing what others missed. His presence was a constant, gentle reminder that the most valuable skills aren't always the loudest. He taught Corporal Davis that a true mechanic doesn't just fix things, he understands them. He taught Sergeant Marcus that true leadership isn't about having all the answers, but about being wise enough to listen to the person who does. And he taught me that sometimes the most important voices in our lives are the ones we've been conditioned to ignore, the ones that don't have a rank or a title. Years have passed since I left that valley, but the sound of that M2 roaring back to life is burned into my soul. It's a sound that reminds me that expertise isn't always found in academies or earned through years of formal training. Sometimes it's found in the quiet hands of those who grew up listening to the silence between the heartbeats of a machine. It's a reminder that we build walls of pride and procedure around ourselves, thinking they'll keep us safe, when all they really do is make us blind and deaf to the simple, elegant truths that are often right in front of our faces, waiting patiently for us to finally pay attention. If you know someone who feels invisible, someone who has a talent that the world isn't ready to see, please share this story with them. It might be the message they need to hear. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the quiet strength found in unexpected places and the courage it takes to trust a voice that no one else can hear. Thank you for listening.